Namaste and welcome to another episode of the Bharat Varta podcast. I'm your host, Roshan Karyappa. It has been a busy couple of weeks, what with the Bihar elections and the various bypolls across the country that have happened. To discuss what this means for the country politically, we have Ashish Chandorkar, Rohit Jayaraman, and Vivek Khaitan on the podcast today. All of whom you've heard on multiple Bharat Varta podcasts earlier, speaking on such things as politics, policy, and culture. So without further ado, welcome to the podcast, guys. Hope you guys had a fantastic Diwali.
Thanks,
Yeah, I
Karen.
did. Hope you did too.
Yeah, lots of sweets and a lot of festivities as well. Good change from what has been a pretty subdued year for us, right? So, all right, let's begin this discussion with a pretty broad question, and I'll come to you, Rohit, first. What is the message from this round of election results?
Right. Thanks for that, Carrie. So I think I'll quickly focus on what the message should be for the BJP and the Congress, right, as the two big national parties. And for the BJP, the message is pretty straightforward. That for now, the Prime Minister remains amazingly popular in the country, and he can carry the party and its allies through pretty tricky situations, right? Especially and obviously in the Hindi heartland. That's something that, and this is in spite of a lot of things that have gone wrong. I mean, just on an obvious front, there's been a global pandemic. India has definitely not been immune to that, and that there have been more contentious issues like as in depending on how on your point of view whether the government did it properly or not, starting from economic growth and the stimulus package, migrant issue, the China issue, all of these things. And I think that the point is that the Prime Minister has pretty much managed to come out of it with his credibility unscathed, especially in the Hindi heartland. And that's where I think the lesson for the Congress comes, right? That they've been going hammer and tongs at the Prime Minister and the BJP over the last 7-8 months, and it's not really made an impact. And at some point, and this has been the Congress strategy for 5-6 years now, right? As in, we've gone through this in our podcast on the Congress. Some point, maybe the Congress should start reflecting on whether this is the right approach or not. Or as we said in our last podcast on the Congress, maybe this is a well thought out plan with certain different aims. But whatever it is, it's currently not really working for the Congress.
Yeah, Carrie, just to add to that, I think the popularity of Prime Minister Modi, I think, became the main factor in the elections potentially in Bihar and phase 2 and phase 3. If you see the numbers coming out of if you see the results of the 3 phases, the Mahagathbandhan actually did quite well in phase 1. In fact, it is quite possible that a lot of exit polls probably used that data to predict the final results, and hence they got the predictions wrong. But the phase 1 was heavily skewed in favor of Mahagathbandhan. In fact, even after phase 2's seat additions, the Mahagathbandhan would have been ahead in the race. The equation completely changed in phase 3, which is when also the PM campaigned quite emotionally on several emotive issues, and also wrote this letter to the Bihar electorate that it's a personal appeal. And that letter did not bear the prime ministerial insignia. He wrote it as an individual letter. And then, of course, Nitish Kumar went and said that this was his last election rally, apparently, not the last election, although it was confused as that being his last election. So with all those factors coming together, the NDA did quite well in the third phase, and that was enough to kind of override the phase 1 results, and the phase 2 gains were consolidated. However, it remains an issue with the BJP that the state leadership has not been defined in several states. The fact with Nitish Kumar alliance also has been that BJP was not confident of winning the state alone, so they had to go with him. They even conceded the CM post much before the results, saying that irrespective of what seats are won, Nitish Kumar will continue to be the CM. So as such, BJP has to look at their state strategy to see at what point do they want to go independent, because all alliances, be it Shiv Sena in Maharashtra or SAD in Punjab, the alliances have eventually broken. The same is going to happen in Bihar as well. The question is of timing. It's more about when and not if. So that's a big factor for the BJP. Of course, the selection of the 2 deputy chief ministers and the folks who are in the ministry probably indicates that BJP is serious about solving that issue in Bihar, at least in the medium to long term. But short term, it remains a problem for the BJP on what state leadership is it projecting, and does that leadership capture enough attention on their own? Because sometimes then the contrast becomes with the PM himself, and then obviously no one is going to kind of be able to fill those shoes. So very few CMs today can win an election without the PM support, which is kind of good and bad. I mean, it kind of reinforces the PM's image, but then it doesn't help at the state level.
Right. So Vivek, we did a podcast on the Bihar elections, right before the thing, and where we analyzed various facets. Seeing how things have panned out, what are your comments?
It was much closer than what we were anticipating, right? And it was largely the impact that we saw in the phase one, which sort of made this election much closer than what we were anticipating. I guess, there were quite a few fascinating aspects of it, which were, either unanticipated or were, sort of less commented upon, which came to the fore. So one of that was that the impact of Chirag Paswan in terms of his winnability was very, very limited, even though his impact in terms of hurting JDU was much larger, right? The other interesting aspect of this election was the performance of left parties. I mean, left as a grouping is now seen as dead and buried as far as electoral politics is concerned. I mean, they do have a lot of influence in TV studios and drawing rooms of Delhi, but as far as electoral politics is concerned, nobody really takes them very seriously. So that was another fascinating aspect of this election, that left parties put up a good show and they won some 16 seats across different left parties. So these were some of the aspects which were kind of interesting to see that the political churning in Bihar is something which is going on. It was much more than we had anticipated, and let's see as to how that sort of impacts the formation of the government and then the performance of the government going ahead.
Right. Staying on the topic of Bihar, Rohit, I think Ashish also alluded to this earlier. In your opinion, do you think Nitish Kumar will have full control? And do you think there is a split imminent with JDU and Congress?
Yeah, I think this is a very good question, right? Because it really depends on your perspective. If you go to ask a lot of hardcore BJP guys, they'll be like, oh, Nitish Kumar is completely at the mercy of the BJP. He'll do whatever the BJP wants. You ask certain other people and you get a counter view that, the BJP really has no other options in Bihar. So if tomorrow Nitish Kumar walks out, what will the BJP do? Because its only other real viable ally, the LJP, went and self-destructed, at least from a seats perspective in this assembly, right? I mean, long-term, a good decision or a bad decision for Chirag Paswan, but at least for right now, he has one MLA, so who's practically thus an independent. So the BJP really is also, not really rich with options in Bihar. Personally, I think there was some reason why Nitish Kumar came back to the NDA in 2017, right? I mean, and those conditions continue to exist. I mean, if at all, the RJD and Tejasvi Yadav have only got more aggressive over the last 3 years, especially after this election. So if he came back because he had a problem with the RJD, then that's only increased. So there's a mix and match. Both parties are not really happy with where they are, but they have good reasons to stay where they are. And I honestly think unless something drastically changes, this should go on till at least 2024. I think 2024, you're going to definitely see some churning, at least with the BJP. So there are two aspects, right? One is the BJP will definitely want more seats to contest in the Lok Sabha elections. In 2019, the BJP actually gave up sitting seats to the JDU because the BJP had 22 or 23 MPs and it contested only 17 seats. So the BJP actually gave up sitting seats to the JDU. So they definitely want to get at least a few back. There is a question of what to do with LJP, right? I mean, whether the BJP really wants to burn all bridges with Chirag Paswan, which is what Nitish wants. I don't know if that's true. That's how the BJP will look at it. So that's definitely 2024. I think is definitely where some will come in. Whether it comes in before that, you really can't tell at this point. I think it'll depend on how things pan out politically across the country.
Right. So RJ, on in a different state in Gujarat, BJP won 8 on 8. Right. Do you think that this juggernaut can ever be stopped?
Actually, I have a slightly different view on these Gujarat bipoles, right? I mean, since 2007 or at least since 2012, BJP has been Congress MLAs to reside in Gujarat again and again. They keep resigning. Most of them keep getting re-elected. But that doesn't really change the overall complexion when the real elections come. I think what one needs to understand is that the Congress has a pretty stable vote base in Gujarat, right? I mean, it's not a winnable, like it has a very low ceiling and a very high floor, right? To put it that way, like it's a perpetual loser which can have a chance of winning once in a while, like when things go really out of control, like what happened in 2017. So I don't think it's more of a juggernaut. It was more that certain local strongmen resigned, and obviously people know that in a bipole there's a pattern to there's a benefit in getting people re-elected, right? I mean, so I wouldn't say that it's as big a juggernaut as it is. It's so it keeps happening, and I mean, let's at least wait till 2022 to see if it really, destroys the Congress per se, to speak, in Gujarat. I mean, obviously, and if you ask me, I think unless someone comes up as an alternative, there's always going to be an alternative, right? And we've said this on many of the other political podcasts. There's always going to be an alternative, because in a democracy you need two parties. Just because a lot of people won't, I mean, unless you are like Alabama in the early 20th century or something, which Gujarat definitely is not. So you'll probably have the Congress with this sort of a rump organization, hoping that the BJP messes up.
Right. So Ashish, moving to your home state of MP, BJP saved the government there quite easily. What do you think the future is there?
Yeah, so MP had bipoles in 28 seats, which were necessitated by Congress MLAs defecting to the BJP, who left the party along with Jyotiraditya Scindia. And there were a couple of MLAs who had passed away. So in total, there were like 28 seats which went to polls. And Congress won 8 of those seats. The fact in MP is that the Kamal Nath government survived a year. They did their own agenda in terms of rearranging the bureaucracy, trying to bring in the policies which they had, let's say the redistribution type policies around handouts and doles, etc. Some of them are implemented, some of them are not. And the expectation for Congress was that people will reward the party. They'll see these people as defecting, people who have defected and have essentially turned a blind eye to the people's mandate, which was given in December 2018, which was against BJP in their assessment. So what actually happened was that BJP went full force into the polls. There was not much division inside the party. I mean, BJP was a very fractious house ahead of the 2018 polls, but this time the party did a good job of coalescing together. And the funny part is that the folks the seats which Congress actually won were all in the general strongholds of Scindia. So they won Sumauli in Morena, the Morena city seat itself, then Dimni also in Morena, Gohad and Bhind, 2 seats in Gwalior, which was Gwalior East and Dabra. Dabra is where Imarti Devi lost, who was one of the ministers in the Kamal Nath government and Shivraj government, and was allegedly abused by Kamal Nath in one of the rallies, and it became a big talking point, but she herself lost. And then Karera and Shivpuri, and Byara and Rajgarh. So of these seats, I mean, Byara is the only logical seat which Congress had to win, because their MLA had died and he was a very popular guy. So his son easily carried the seat. But the other seats essentially were all Scindia strongholds. So so Scindia's position in the party in that sense still remains a little untenable. I mean, not untenable, but let's say not still slightly weak, because The victories came on in the Malwa region mainly, which is essentially the region where Kailash Vijayvargiya is very strong, and he was also overseeing elections in 6 seats. So as such, the BJP's own internal balance in the state remains fairly finely placed. Shivraj Singh Chauhan will have a decent majority, so he will have a full term without any issues. He cannot be destabilized at this point. Having said that, Scindia, who could be potentially a chief minister candidate at some point of time, will have to bide his time either in Delhi as a central minister or just wait in the state for at least this term. No immediate changes are possible, and in that sense, the other actors like within the party, like Narendra Singh Tomar, Kailash Vijayvargiya, they all stay relevant in their own relative context. So fairly interesting result in that sense. What will happen is that for Shivraj Singh Chauhan now, he will have to assess what new does he bring into the state. One of the reasons he lost potentially in December 2018 was that people did not see as much movement happening from his past terms. He was very agriculture focused, where of course he did a brilliant job, but the needs change as things change. People get used to that change, and they were probably expecting. The voters were probably expecting much more than agriculture. So it's a big challenge for CM Chauhan to really outdo himself and work in areas which are not really his sweet spots. So that remains to be seen as to what happens in the next 3 years until the next election.
I think I'll just pitch in here on one thing, right? And I think AC mentioned when he mentioned that most of these seats the Congress won were in the Scindia strongholds. I think one thing that needs to be mentioned here is that again the BJP slipped up in Morena and Bhind, right? I mean, it's been happening since 2000, and it happened really badly in 2018. It's explained away as part of Scindia, the general Scindia for CM movement that happened there, and it happened again, right? And I think there's a case to be made here that the BJP simply is either due to internal or external reasons failed to really manage the caste calculus there, right? And this is true even in Rajasthan, in the sense that the parts of Rajasthan that border this region, that's eastern Rajasthan, is where the BJP got really badly thrashed in 2018 and struggled even in the Lok Sabha elections. I mean, some of the narrower margins came from here. So there's a larger sub region here which poses some caste issues for the BJP. And I mean, I'm mentioning this because if you look at the larger context of the Hindi heartland, it's literally a sea of saffron. And you see this oddity, right? So I'm sure the BJP can probably, it has a good 3 years to figure out what exactly is the issue here, how it can handle plays with, and by MP standards, it's the most caste conscious region of MP, right? So again, with your whole Hindutva vote that the BJP depends on, how it sometimes struggles in the phase of caste. This is one more example of that.
Right. So Rohit, can you also talk us through the results in Dubaka, Baroda and RR Nagar, what the significance is?
Yeah, I think 3 states with very different political contexts and very unique bipoles. Let's start with the one in Telangana, because I think that's probably nationally the most important bipole that there was, right? I mean, the TRS has literally swept the state at a state level for the last 6 years, literally ruled like an uncrowned kingdom with, and then you have this bipole. And I mean, long term, the BJP has been concentrating on Telangana, and there was a very good case made by a lot of people that BJP can come next in Telangana, right? I mean, due to its particular history of rule by the Nizam, the traditional strength of the BJP in these parts. I mean, BJP used to win, the Jan Sangh used to win assembly seats here in the 60s, and all issues with the TDP, etc., had stemmed that of BJP. But the 2019 Lok Sabha elections was a massive sort of boost for the BJP, and now the BJP has managed to transfer that into assembly elections, right? In the sense that starting with this guy, with the new appointment of Bandi Sanjay as state PCC president, an attempt at OBC consolidation. So what's happened really is the Congress seems to have lost one more state, in the sense that BJP is now clearly the main opposition. The TRS is very scared. There was news today that they've advanced the Hyderabad corporation polls, and they're holding it in 10 days, like with just 10 days notice, because they're literally scared of what the BJP is going to do there. So clearly one new state and one new frontier has opened up. 2 points I just want to mention here. One was this is exactly what Asaduddin Owaisi had warned Sonia Gandhi against doing when she created Telangana, right? Because Telangana was always ripe for BJP to grow, and actually the fact that it was, clubbed with what is today Andhra Pradesh sort of had actually reduced the space of the BJP to grow. And Owaisi was very correct when he said that, creating Telangana will just help the BJP. That's what's going to happen. And I think the other thing is that TRS may not be as cooperative as it was in the Rajya Sabha for getting bills passed. Of course, the composition of the Rajya Sabha has changed, but and TRS may not be as needed. But I think you're going to see a much more aggressive KCR against the Prime Minister.
Right.
Coming to Baroda seat in Haryana, it was there in it's a seat in the Jat belt, Sonipat district, very much a Huda stronghold, right? It's a part of the Jat belt that is under Bhupinder Singh Huda. It was won even in 2014 by the Congress. In 2019, the Congress managed a much better win, because managed a very narrow win with the JJP cutting a large vote, and BJP had fielded the Olympian Yogeshwar Dutt, who lost by a very narrow margin in 2019. Again, the MLA died. I think the Congress fielded his wife, and BJP again fielded Yogeshwar Dutt. The difference here was the JJP didn't contest. So I think there was obviously the BJP expected that JJP votes would transfer. And I think obviously that didn't happen with the farmers' agitation, the whole Jat pride and concept coming in. And I mean, the Congress candidate being a Jat, etc. But considering all of that, the Congress wanted 10,000 votes. If I was Haryana BJP, I would not be too unhappy about this result. And I think it's probably some sort of a status quo result in Haryana. Coming to Karnataka, I mean, R.R. Nagar was expected. I mean, the Congress really in Bangalore is now party of, or at least in 2018 was a party of local strongmen plus minorities. Now most of those local strongmen have moved to the BJP. Muniratna was just the last of them after your Bhairati Baswaraj and S.T. Somshekhar and others, and that was obviously a cakewalk, I think, honestly, for the BJP. The other more interesting seat was Sira, where again the BJP managed to win in one more seat in Old Mysore, which it had never really done well. Even in the 2008 glory days of Yadurappa, Sira was where BJP did not do well at all. Sira has generally been a drag on the BJP even in the Chitradurga Lok Sabha seat, and after KR Pet in Mandya, which happened last year, when the BJP managed to win it in a bypoll. Now winning Sira is pretty big because it's the other part of the Vokaliga belt, right? I mean, Mandya, Mysore is one part. Other part is parts of Tumkur, Kolar, etc. And winning that, I think, whether it was the efforts of various people in the party, whoever they may be, I think the BJP's biggest weakness in Karnataka was they were never really fighting on 224 seats, right? I mean, they had this huge hole in Old Mysore. Now they've really filling that up. So I would say BSY is on a pretty strong wicket for a re-election if he's the chief minister in 2023.
I have a question on MP for Ashish. So BJP was able to form the government only due to the rebellion by Jyotiraditya Scindia, and he walked away from Congress with some MLAs, which actually necessitated this bypoll. So do you think that there would be a sense in his camp that he has delivered in the bypoll as well, and would strengthen his hand in the BJP in terms of his negotiation, either for a deputy CM kind of post? I guess he would want to make his career in the state politics rather than central politics at the moment.
See, the difference between MP and Rajasthan even in 2018 was that while Sachin Pilot accepted the DCM post in Rajasthan, Scindia actually refused to do that in MP. He wanted to be the CM, and it's a very fair point that his name was used in the campaign by Congress, and like as Rohit alluded to that, the Chambal area voted on his name as CM, right? In fact, the BJP's own slogan was "Maaf karo Maharaj, Hamara Neta to Shivraj." So BJP itself was expecting Scindia to become the CM in case Congress came to power and not Kamal Nath. So in that sense, I don't think he has any aspirations to be a DCM. Certainly not a DCM to Shivraj Singh Chauhan, who's now run his course in the state as a long-serving CM, right? And I mean, add 3 more years to that definitely. So for him, it makes no sense to accept the DCM post. Either he can do nothing and wait to be the CM candidate at some point of time, or he can be in Delhi, which as the cabinet in the reshuffle is expected. The thing is that with the results which came in, Congress winning 8 seats and all in Scindia's stronghold. So Scindia delivered for BJP, but BJP hasn't yet delivered for Scindia. It has become like that, right? So like some of the sitting ministers have lost. Folks who lost included some of the existing ministers who were in the Shivraj cabinet after Scindia had defected. So they obviously will not get the ministerial post back. I think there are 3 vacant posts now, and I think there's one more is possible in the sense that there weren't enough ministers who were sworn in. So there are, I think, 4 posts now vacant. So as such, they will obviously go back to the old BJP loyalists in that sense. So Scindia may actually have lesser control. I mean, he will have more control than what he had in the Kamal Nath government, definitely, but certainly lesser control than what he would have expected when he defected. So he will have to now bide his time. I suppose he will, if the reshuffle happens now. There's no parliament session potentially, right? What we are hearing. So there could be a reshuffle happening. Generally, reshuffles happen after the parliament sessions are over, so that the minister, the portfolios are well understood on the floor of the house when someone answers the question. But if there's no session, the reshuffle can happen any time between now and the budget. So as such, I think he will get nothing very great in at least till the next election. Remains to be seen if the BJP hoists him as a CM candidate. Compared to other defectors, his respect and his acceptability is much higher. The fact is that his grandmother really literally formed the party, right? And like her money, her sweat and blood has got into formation of the BJP. So as such, he's not an untouchable. People respect him in the party, and he's not seen as an outsider. So that works for him vis-a-vis, let's say, some of the other people who have come in from Congress to the BJP. But still, 3 years of, let's say, a long wait for him ahead.
Right. So let's stay on topic of Congress itself. Vivek, I mean, you had Salman Khurshid come out and say in the news that he blamed the voters for quote unquote resisting liberal values after the poor showing in Bihar. What do you make of the Congress?
Yeah, so it's rather unfortunate that Congress politics has become the drawing room politics of Delhi. And that's really the tragedy of the Congress as well as the Indian politics in a way where there is no second pole. I mean, Prime Minister Modi deserves, all the fan following, all the support that he has, but there is nobody else really on the other side as well to challenge him, right? So if you see Congress, the implosion of Congress has been, a long drawn process for last 20 years. It is completely wiped out in the Hindi heartland. I mean, it's a kind of a junior partner and fights on the number of seats which one would consider humiliating for a national party, right? Even if you look at states like MP and Gujarat, where it is the second largest or one of the 2 biggest parties in that state. It's a 2-party state, these 2. And it polls significant number of votes. I mean, its voting vote share is close to 40% in both the states, but still is not able to either throw up good leaders, or if it does, it is not able to manage the house. And all of that actually boils down to the simple fact that number one, Gandhi family has lost its charisma as far as voters are concerned, and it is not able to enthuse the party leaders either. And the specter of Rahul Gandhi, I mean, unfortunately, he is not someone who is made for politics, even though he's quite committed ideologically. But as far as electoral politics is concerned, his understanding is rather limited. And that kind of puts a ceiling to how much Congress can grow, in state politics. The Gandhis don't deliver anymore, and they are not able to put forward good names in state politics either. So that's kind of become a very, very unfortunate situation for Congress party, where it doesn't know where can it go from here.
Right. Rohit, Ashish, you guys want to add to what VK said?
Yeah, I'll just add that we had this conversation on Bharat Varta on the future of Congress, right? And I think we broadly agreed on that chat. Rohit was there in that discussion as well. We broadly agreed that the party is very difficult to be run without the Gandhis. And the reason is that they provide the glue. Otherwise, Congress then becomes a regional, like a collection of regional satraps. But they all brought together by the Gandhi family. So the timing of Kapil Sibbal's latest rebellion is quite interesting, with Ahmed Patel being in hospital and ICU with COVID-related complications. He's generally the troubleshooter for the Gandhi family, and now he's not available. So I think Rashid Kidwai, who's one of the veteran journalists and probably the best watcher of the old Congress, has written a scathing article today in India Today, I believe, where he says that some of this old guard is now trying to take advantage of the fact that Ahmed Patel is not there to sort things out. So maybe there are enough people who are trying to look at, can they split the party or can they run the party? I mean, I think splitting the party is too much of an ambition, because then the very few people actually carry that clout in the state, basically, to win an election themselves. And because all of these four leaders are in Rajya Sabha, which also needs states to be won, and Congress is already suffering there with less than, I think, 40 Rajya Sabha MPs now, and hardly any states to renew the Rajya Sabha membership from. The chances that someone will split the party actually are quite low, although it may sound ambitious and people may want to be making the right noises. But yes, I think the strategy of Congress, or at least Rahul Gandhi, is quite clear that he will not try to change the country's view in the way he thinks. He will wait for that to happen socially in any case, because he has years ahead of him. Even if he has to wait for 10 years, 15 years, it is still possible that he one day becomes the PM, because the country starts thinking the way he does today, right? So I think that is a distinct possibility, which and I think he's playing towards that. And we had discussed this in much more detail in the I think it was episode 23 or 24 of Bharat Varta.
I think I'll just pitch in here on this point, right, on what Rahul Gandhi thinks and his long-term plan. I think the US elections probably provide a good example of why this may not be as good a plan as even we thought it would be, right? Because even in a country with literally a 60K per capita income, if you look at what happened in the US, the Democrats really got hammered in Senate and House races. And I wouldn't say hammered, but nowhere close to expectations, even though they were running against literally the most unpopular president in modern times, just because they were too woke, right? And I mean, Rahul Gandhi's whole point is to become woke. Then if, the US is not ready for woke politics at a per capita income of 60,000, then like the time frame for India to really be ready for it may be much longer. And I think I just want to on Sibal, I think his current interview made me actually feel a lot less sympathetic for this point of view, right? In the sense that Sibal really doesn't have any ideas on what to change about the Congress appeal. I mean, the Congress's problem right now, if you look at it a bit differently, is that, and as I think Harsh mentioned on Twitter, our regular contributor Harsh Madhusudan, that there's an ideological issue with the Congress, and it's disconnected. If you look at Sibal, he seems to have made this more into a personality fight with Rahul Gandhi, while at the same time mentioning that, while at the same time sprouting the same beliefs that Rahul Gandhi believes in. I mean, if Congress is to be a vehicle for liberal woke values, then at least let it be Rahul Gandhi who can win some seats rather than Sibal who can't probably even win a municipality election. I mean, like if there's no coherent ideological issues there, then the Gandhi family definitely serves its purpose as the figurehead of liberal values in India, which it has done for the last 70, 80 years.
Right. Somehow I can be rest assured that we get the best content out of Rohit whenever the topic of Congress comes up. So there's that. So Rohit, there's also, I mean, this election saw the rise of MIM, right? They won about 5 seats in Bihar. Maybe you could talk us through a little bit of the reasons for their rise and, you know, what their ongoing impact will be like. And perhaps, I mean, VK can chip in after that as well.
Sure, Carrie. I think one of the most, at least for me, the entertaining things post the Bihar election was a general meltdown on MIM, right? I mean, starting from Congress supporters to then some BJP supporters, everyone went into a meltdown on MIM winning some seats in Bihar. And I mean, to be more specific, I think mostly in the Kishanganj Lok Sabha constituency of Bihar. I mean, beyond a point, the meltdown was really funny to me at least. And I just evaluated in 3-4 grounds, right? In the sense, what did it mean for the MIM, what did it mean for the Congress, what it meant for the BJP, and what it meant for the people who vote for the MIM, which I think are almost exclusively Muslims. I think for the MIM, it makes sense, right? I mean, why would any party not contest anywhere? And even when we were looking at the Bihar results the last 1 or 2 hours when it was swinging, everyone knew that the 5 MLAs of the MIM, and that had stabilized quite early on, would support the Mahagathbandhan. Obviously, there would be a quid pro quo, whether it be ministry, not a ministry, or something that's obviously going to be a quid pro quo. And I mean, why would the MIM not do that? So I think the whole thing works really well for the MIM. The question really comes, does it work well for the Congress, which used to get these votes, and for the people who used to vote for the Congress and who today vote for the MIM? I think the answer is no in both cases. I mean, the Congress obviously loses 5 seats, right? I mean, in this case, those 5 seats, if you look at the results, all of them would have been won either by the Congress or the RJD. And the psychological impact of 125, 115 and 125, 110 is quite different. So clearly that's one thing the Congress lost, and obviously the MIM is hitting the Congress from its, I wouldn't say the left flank, but I would say from its minority flank, right? And at a time when the Congress is increasingly finding it difficult to sort of get votes from Hindus in a lot of states in India, especially I would say upper caste and OBC Hindus, it's really the last thing the Congress needs is somebody hitting on it from the other side. As for the voters, I mean, I think one interesting thing here is that the MIM actually did not make the UPA/Mahagathbandhan, whatever you want to call it, lose any seats, right? I mean, someone did a detailed analysis on that, and you look at the voting patterns, it is very clear that MIM votes came only in those segments where, I think the Muslim population was comfortably above 50%, that there was really no threat of the NDA candidate winning, even with the vote split. The vote split was so overwhelmingly in favor of the MIM that the MIM would win anyway. So I think that shows that clearly what's happening is Muslims feel that the Congress is anyway, or at least a section of the Muslims feel that the Congress anyway not, Congress and its allies, in this case the RJD, is anyway not going to come into political power. So why not try parties that are more open about Muslim issues, right? And Owaisi, for instance, went on Rajdeep's show, and I mean, he abused Rajdeep, and a lot of people got very happy about that. But what he actually told Rajdeep did not really make any sense, if you ask me. I mean, he said Rahul Gandhi is politically incompetent to take on the prime minister. But when Rahul Gandhi has been pretty much speaking a lot of things Owaisi would want him to speak, unless he's saying that Rahul Gandhi should start turning into a Hindutva leader, which is definitely not what he's saying, then his criticism actually doesn't, if you ask me, make a lot of sense. So I think the Congress is really being pulled in by Owaisi. And that I think takes me to my second point, which is some point. I mean, Muslims also, when they vote for MIM, what happens is there's a massive polarization, right? And not just in those seats. MIM contesting itself polarizes Hindus also in other neighboring seats. If you look at Seemanchal's results, 24 seats of the region, I think NDA won around 12 out of 24. I may be wrong by 1 or 2 seats here and there, but broadly, and you look certain seats, and I think some anti-MIM Muslims were mentioning this on Twitter, that even in seats where Muslims were good 40% and Yadavs were 15-20%, BJP was getting 49 to 50% vote share. And that really is a flip side of the MIM, I think, at least for the people who are voting for it, that it really, I mean, polarizes Hindus not just in those seats, but in neighboring seats. And what it does to the Congress also is that it tries to pander even more to Muslims, right? I mean, in the sense that there's this thing that Congress really lost this election in Darbhanga and Madhubani. I mean, the RJD and the Congress. And part of the reason for that was when they went for this, when they fielded, because there was massive communal polarization after Congress fielded that Usmani guy who was, accused, who was involved in the whole Jinnah portrait controversy. Now, of course, it also points to Rahul Gandhi's woke tendencies to have given him a ticket. But it's also clearly an attempt to sort of hold on to the Muslim vote. And that resulted in massive counter polarization. So I think this whole thing really works well for the BJP and for the MIM, because BJP benefits from this counter polarization, but really doesn't work well for the people who are voting for the MIM.
Is it, Rohit, one question for you? Do you think this is the best performance of a purely Muslim party in Hindi heartland in last, whatever, 30 years?
See, VK, I think yes, because I don't think anyone else has really campaigned as a purely Muslim party. But if you really look at the kind of people who have won on the MIM ticket, etc., these are people who have been there in Congress, who have been there in RJD, who have been there even in JDU. I think at some point, elections, I think, and I may not be very this thing here, but elections in, I mean, Congress, at least in some of these places, had become a purely Muslim party a long term back. I mean, so while you can say that MIM is, of course, it's led by a Muslim, etc. And that's where I think voting for MIM is not really a smart tactical choice, because, I mean, the Congress, at least in the last 10-15 years, has been fronting some of the more sectarian demands pretty well. I mean, maybe I'm speaking as someone who's not obviously from this region or the community, but at least to an outsider, it looks like that.
Yes, I'll take on this MIM. I have a slightly different take, and I'll take a relatively longer view. I mean, if you see the post-independence politics has, in terms of elections, have essentially been about Congress party creating an alliance in each state where it was one dominant caste or two dominant castes along with Muslims and winning elections through and through. That's the kind of template which every regional party followed as well. I mean, it's only the BJP pole of the electoral politics which is different in that sense, right? But if you look at, let's say, pre-independence history, in many ways, I mean, Congress used to represent Muslims as well for a long, long time. And obviously, the context was different, and history does not really, work in linear fashion. But over a period of time, Muslim politics became very strong, and that's how these kind of shoots. I mean, MIM today is very small, and it kind of helps BJP more than the Congress by contesting in places like Bihar. So one has to see as to how this kind of develops in the longer term, where Muslims start not just in Bihar but in a lot of places start seeing parties like MIM as the real alternative. It will have two consequences. One is that the game for parties like Congress is over, where I mean, they anyway are, as Rohit said, not getting Hindu votes a lot. And if Muslim votes also kind of goes purely to Muslim parties, then there's game up for them. And the second is that the even though Congress represented Muslim issues as well, the strength as well as the aggression with which a Muslim party would represent purely Muslim issues would be very, very different. And that's where the real challenge for India would perhaps lie. I mean, it may be something which is 20 years down the line, but this is something that one should be wary of.
Right. Okay, moving on to another significant aspect of these elections. One thing that we realized from these results was the popularity and acceptance of the Prime Minister Modi, right? So, Ashish, your comments on that specifically?
Yeah. See, one thing which we need to see, Gary, is that people evaluate the work of the PM very differently compared to what the commentariat does, including probably the commentariat on his own side. See, whatever be the situation, be it whatever be the difficult situation now in this case, pandemic, his word is trusted by people, and it is trusted in a way which probably is not able, like a lot of people are not able to explain how that works, right? So, at least in Bihar, of course, Bihar actually did a fairly remarkable job of controlling the pandemic, which also is a story which is missed out because TV doesn't reach Bihar very easily. But something was done well there. We don't know what that is. Hopefully, someone will tell a story someday about that too. But even otherwise, like the whole migrant labor issue, I mean, of course, Biharis were really affected by that. And we heard the stories of how people had to walk hundreds of kilometers to go back to their hometowns, or they went without food, etc. Or the rebellions, or protests, rather, I shouldn't say rebellions, but protests which were seen in the Indian cities for people wanting to go back. None of that actually impacted the election as such, right? So I think people understand that when something goes wrong, there are hardships to be dealt with. There could be a spontaneous demonstration of anger, etc. But that is not directed against the PM. And time and again, the opposition parties have tried to redirect it to the PM, and they have failed. So the fact is that people actually take PM's. I think the basic factor is that his intentions are are believed to be completely clean and completely above board, and people trust him on his intentions. Whether the words and actions, the way they are portrayed, even if they don't match the ideal state being that no one will go hungry in a pandemic, or people will get a train to go back, don't have to walk, etc. Which I think people understand that is not practical in these times. When something goes wrong, everyone suffers, due to that. So I think that part people understand, but the general commentariat doesn't. And yet again, it was proven that his personal appeal, draws people to the polling booths. In fact, one remarkable thing, that the voting percentage in most seats was actually the same or higher compared to the last election, despite Corona being there, right? So people also did not fear the fact that, I mean, they wanted to vote and did their task quite responsibly. In a percentage sense, obviously the voting actually went up a little bit, which means absolute numbers would have been higher. So I think the fact that PM is popular and head and shoulders above everyone else popular is no longer a debate. Now the question is, what can that be used for by the BJP, and how in the elections to come, and of course for the political capital which is needed to get the policies through. I think that is the new or the next problem to deal with. But certainly this will make a big. This would certainly impact the Bengal election in a very positive way for the BJP, because of the neighboring. Obviously there are all of Bihari voters themselves in Bengal directly, but also the fact that they're neighboring states, and the folklore of Bihar will carry into the Bengal election definitely.
I just pitch in here on a couple of things, right? I think the biggest thing, and Ashi sort of mentioned that, is this whole disconnect that the commentariat has. And it's sort of amazing that the Indian commentariat is so closely, mirroring its American and probably the British equivalent in being so disconnected, right? I mean, in the sense that these are not similar countries, but the commentariat / elite seem very similar. And that's something which is very interesting, I would say, and is responsible for a lot of this weird disconnect / disbelief that happens whenever election results happen. I mean, people think that the Prime Minister is unpopular. There are that start. I think this whole cycle will go on for another 2 weeks, where people keep talking about how popular the Prime Minister is. Then either some foreign agency will say something, or somebody else will say something, or some GDP report will come, or some report on some jobs data by some portal will come, and everybody will again say, oh, the PM is unpopular. Then they will start from demonetization, they will write GST, and then they will mention something about failure to India has a largest number of some number of coronavirus cases. And then a lot of uncontextual, really random things are mentioned, and then they get confused again. And I mean, this happened even in 2014, right? Lots of people debunked the Gujarat model on statistics. I think that's where this whole thing comes, because a lot of the people who are writing these articles excessively focus either on statistics or look at it from their point of view. That sort of creates issues, because they're actually trying to explain what they think the world ought to be and not what the world is. And just to give one example on Bihar, right? Like, I was just reading up about bridges in Bihar across the Ganga. Now the Ganga pretty much bifurcates what's today's Bihar. And there were I think 2 or 3 bridges in the entire state. Now, if you just read Wikipedia, and I did this just for 15 minutes, you can see that there are literally some 4 to 5 bridges being built across the Ganga right now, most of which were conceived either in the 80s, the 70s, the 90s. A lot of them, interestingly, had their foundation stone laid during the time of the Vajpayee government. Quite a few of them were either completed in the first term of the government or are being completed now. Then there was this whole articles on pipe water. Right now, I don't know how accurate it is, whether 90% of Bihar has access to piped water. But really, at some point, people need to understand that these things do matter rather than random data, right? I mean, India has the world's second largest population, so it's bound, and the largest populated country in the world, let's say, is not known for statistical accuracy. So it's bound, just by basic logic, it's bound to happen that India will have one of the largest number of cases of coronavirus in the world. So, why are people saying this? I mean, everyone is free to say what they want, but then you'll get surprised, right? And I think, yeah.
Right. And, just a quick diversion there. We covered some of these infrastructure projects on 1 or 2 weeklies, right, Ashish?
Yeah, can you see, I think we've discussed this before, but I think I want to reiterate this point. See, people evaluate change with respect to their current position. They don't evaluate change in terms of an ideal end state. So, for example, if 50 people were getting water and now 70 are getting water, the 20 who got it additionally are going to be very happy. Now you can curse the government for not getting to 100, but the fact is that you cannot take away the happiness of the 20 who have actually got water. What happens is that, as Rohit said, a lot of criticism has got entangled in numbers. Like, the government will say, no, 73 people have got water, and someone will say, no, it is 71, you are lying. And the whole debate becomes 73 versus 71, and the fact that the government was lying, apparently. What is not understood is that the 21 people who actually got water are likely to vote for that government, right? So you can say that, you can quibble that because of you proving that the data was only 97% accurate, and hence the government is supposed to lose. What you don't understand is that the data was 97% accurate, which actually makes the government overwhelmingly the favorite to win the next time, right? I think that difference was not understood, even when the whole rural electrification was on. I mean, I wrote about it for 3 years at a stretch, three and a half years, and then Modi ji took away my one line of writing because all the villages were finally electrified and all the households were also electrified. But this kept happening for every article I wrote about how power sector was changing, someone will say that no, but this data is not 100% accurate, 100% reliable. Fair enough. One day it became 100% reliable, right? It all ended one day. I think that is where the challenge is. People typically miss the forests for the trees. A lot of the analysis happens on the basis of trees, which is not really how people see it. And as Rohit said, we sitting outside Bihar, we cannot really judge the importance of those 5 bridges in Bihar, right? If you have to really travel 200 kilometers to get from point A to point B, and now you only travel 25 kilometers across the bridge. I mean, that I'm sure counts for something for people who are living there. And I think that line of infrastructure evaluation is kind of very theoretical. We don't do an impact analysis of infrastructure. We do a numerical statistical analysis of infrastructure, which I think is not very useful in political terms. You can, of course, do graphs, etc., and all of that. But the real impact, the human impact has to be evaluated in experiential terms and not in an absolutist sense.
Yeah, I think overall, I think we tend to overestimate quantitative data, underestimate qualitative data, right? In fact, I mean, I think VK, you mentioned this on a previous podcast, if I remember correctly, on this bridge specifically. I think you mentioned a story.
On
Yeah.
that
So
point, so see,
yeah,
Bihar is one of the most water-rich states in India, right? So it's not really, very long bridges or infrastructure projects which cuts distance, by a significant amount, etc., which is important. What matters is, even if you have to travel 60 kilometers, you will see 20 bridges, 20 small bridges on the way. And if those bridges break, then obviously the, life goes haywire. So that if you see, hundreds of bridges have been built. If you look at the power situation in Bihar, I mean, it's not 24/7 power that you get in Bihar, but if you compare to what you were getting 6 hours earlier, now you get 18 hours. So it's a fairly significant jump that you see. Not just that, in terms of quality of power, earlier the voltage used to be so low that even if you had power, it mattered very little. Now the quality of power itself has improved. The grids have become much better compared to what it was in the past. So yes, that change is something that people see in their lives. Even I mean, I am a non-resident Bihari in that sense. So we are relatively more cynical compared to people who live in Bihar, and they do feel this change. And that's significant, and that's what has sort of given the NDA alliance its victory in many ways.
right. Okay, that's a positive, optimistic note to end the podcast on. VK, anything on the future as such? I mean, how this election will bode for us, in the coming days for Bihar specifically?
So, the sense that, I had before the election was that even though NDA may win, it may be, in terms of political evolution in Bihar will remain kind of a stalemate, which does not seem to be the case. There seems to be a concerted effort, at least by BJP, to put in place a new leadership and prepare new leadership, for Bihar's future. If you see, Nitish loomed very large in Bihar's politics for last, 15 years, and he was the face not just of the government but of the alliance. And the face of the BJP, Mr. Sushil Modi, was practically seen as, not just, let's say that a deputy to Nitish Kumar in every way. I mean, the identification of Sushil Modi with JDU was, or rather Nitish was fairly significant. So there was this dilution of BJP that you would see in Bihar. It seems that BJP is making an effort to assert its influence, while keeping in mind that Nitish is the face of the alliance and will continue to remain CM. So in that sense, we'll have to see what kind of government gets on, what solution happens. As far as Nitish is concerned, not many people expect him to be, the hands-on active CM that he was in his first 7-8 years from 2005 to 12. I think there is a sense that everybody has been getting for the last 3-4 years that he has kind of lost steam. He does not really, take interest in the governance as much as he used to do. And maybe he's short of ideas. If you see all the low-hanging fruits in terms of, improving the law and order situation, improving the basic infrastructure, etc., it's something that he has largely achieved. And then going beyond that in terms of, bringing in industry, getting investments in the state is something that he has not really shown any imagination for that. You look at places like Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh, and there the governments have shown a lot of imagination and attracted a lot of investments, which does not seem to be the case in the case of Bihar. So let's see as to, and this is something which will boil down to BJP, because the JDU part or the Nitish part of the alliance is not something which is focused on it. So let's see how it sort of evolves over the next 3-4 years, and how Bihar shapes up.
All right. So that's the end of the podcast. We discussed a wide variety of things. Thank you so much, Rohit, VK, and Ashish for this enlightening discussion, and hope to catch you all on another podcast of Bharat Varta. Thank you for tuning in. This podcast was brought to you by the team at Bharat Varta. If you liked this podcast, then don't forget to share, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite platforms. We're available on Anchor, Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Breaker, YouTube, and a host of other platforms. We started Bharat Varta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you do wish to offer us any feedback on the content or anything else, do reach out to us on social media or get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvarta.in. The links are in the description below. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.